Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Hobson Wildenthal, the Provost, University of Texas at Dallas, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Burton Einspruch Lecture on the Holocaust. The Einspruch Lecture is the major annual public event of our Holocaust Studies program. Generous and engaged friends over the years have supported our Holocaust Studies program with gifts that have created endowments for the Jaffe Holocaust Library, for the Einspruch Lectures on the Holocaust, and Dr. Bert Einspruch just walked in, just so we could get going. Bert, thank you. The Lewis Chair of Holocaust Studies, and I saw Mimi and Mitch Barnett come in not too long ago and waved at them. Mimi and Mitch, somewhere out there. And the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies. Mr. Ackerman couldn't be here this afternoon, he has a bad back. This generous support, and many friends have contributed to this support, greatly enhance what UTD does in offering education dealing with the Holocaust. We can count years in academia either by the calendar or by the academic year, and so I'm kind of switching back and forth. I've been talking about the academic year. This is this year's Einspruch Lecture, but if we look back more or less over the calendar year of 2008, several events really stand out. Just about a year ago, with Mr. Ackerman's support, Niels Romer and Gigi Oswald put on the conference Echoes of a Century that many of you engaged with and benefited from. During that same 2008, the Belofsky Graduate Fellowship Endowment was created. And also over 2008, again with Mr. Ackerman's impetus, we significantly expanded the undergraduate curriculum at UTD dealing with the Holocaust and taught by Ms. Debbie Pfister. And then finally, most spectacularly, during 2008, the leadership of Mr. John Massey and Mr. Hill Feinberg and their friends, we were able to create the Hill Feinberg Distinguished Chair in Holocaust Studies. And Mr. and Mrs. Massey are with us today. John and Libba, thank you so much for this latest leadership. And it went beyond generosity. You note I said generous and engaged. And in meeting with Mr. Massey and Mr. Feinberg, with Gigi and Bert, we had a long discussion about Holocaust studies issues. And John mentioned his deep interest in the Ukrainian Holocaust and asked if we'd ever had a lecture dealing with that. And I'd say we don't need to be reminded twice. We hadn't, and we went back and started doing research, and that research quickly turned up a leading young scholar who we immediately got on the internet and telephone and invited to give this year's lecture. So John, thank you for your generosity and for your intellectual leadership, both. With that, it's now my pleasure to turn the podium over to Sally Belofsky, the fantastic chairman of our advisory board for Holocaust Studies at UTD. Sally.
Thank you very much. John and Libba, the news of that professorship hit me for the first time, so it's wonderful, and we thank you so much for that. We have some people that need to be recognized here before we start with the formal part of the program. We're honored to have with us this afternoon the president of the University of Texas at Dallas, David Daniel, and his wife Susan. Would you stand? The Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities, Dennis Kratz. Is Dennis here? There. And Dr. Wildenthal already recognized Dr. Einsbruck, for whom this lecture series is named and endowed. Mimi Lewis Barnett and Mitch Barnett are here, and it was their parents, Leah and Paul Lewis, who, for whom the chair that Professor Ashfath holds is named. I'd like Mimi and Mitch to be recognized. Where are you? And also we have with us the members of the advisory board. In the program that you have, the names are listed in the back. These are people who dedicate a lot of time and energy and effort to make sure that this program continues and flourishes. So would the members of the advisory board please stand? And we do have a lot of students here today from UTD, Holocaust Studies students in the various classes. They are our future, so I'd like them to stand to be recognized too, the students. We're honored today to have with us Dr. Wendy Lower, who will be introduced formally in a few minutes. She flew in from cold Munich yesterday, didn't get much sleep, but I think she's ready to go. And as Dr. Wildenthal said, once the subject of Ukraine was mentioned, the search went on to find out who would be the best and the latest researcher and author to talk on that subject, and up popped Wendy Lower, and I know you're going to be delighted to meet her, as I was delighted to meet her last night. In doing a little research for today's subject, I found in my files that 2 years ago, on September 29th, 2006, was the 65th anniversary of Babi Yar. And the president of the Ukraine, Viktor Yushchenko, is he still the president? Spoke at Babi Yar. And as you know, Babi Yar is the place where 33,000 Jews, men, women, and children were murdered in just 3 days. And he and the other heads of state paid tribute to the victims. And he said, "Time can heal wounds, but time should never erase them from our memory. May the memory of all who perished live eternally." You know, at the anniversaries of Babi Yar and the liberation of Auschwitz, heads of state all speak of the need to keep awareness of the Holocaust alive and well, because it won't be too long before all the survivors and witnesses have gone. What most people don't realize is that this great university has been dedicated to teaching the causes, effects, and after effects of the Holocaust for more than 2 decades. It was here at this university that Professor Ashfath developed a unique research intensive curriculum that has had far-reaching effects on UTD students, many of whom have chosen to become scholars and teachers of the Holocaust in high schools, colleges, and museums, and many more will follow. Professor Ashfath is now joined by Professor Niels Romer and Debbie Pfister, and together they teach 16 classes a year, including a new introduction to the Holocaust, which had to be capped at 50 because they had so many students applying. But I'm sure that Hobson will find a way to have more classes next year. The motto of the Holocaust Studies program is appropriately teaching the past and changing the future. In these 16 Holocaust and European history courses, UTD students learn not only the history, the causes, and the effects of the Holocaust, but the important lessons of tolerance, compassion, respect for human rights of all people, that evil must be confronted, that Holocaust deniers must be challenged, that victims must never be forgotten, and probably most importantly, that we are each responsible for our own actions and inactions. Now it is my pleasure to call upon Professor Ashfath the creator and founder of the Holocaust Studies program at UTD, an internationally recognized author, historian, lecturer, professor of literary studies, the history of ideas, herself a Holocaust survivor, holder of the Leah and Paul Lewis Chair of Holocaust Studies, a beloved teacher, expert cook, accomplished musician, mother, wife, grandmother, Professor Ashvat.
Thank you, Sally, very much. What can one say after such introduction? I just would like to welcome you too to this wonderful occasion, which we have yearly, and which we have the luxury and the fantastic possibility to have, due to all of you who have helped us to create this program. I must say that despite of all the praise, I am completely innocent, because I started to teach the Holocaust and that was all. Everything else came from outside, came from help, came from you, and in the very first place came from the Vice President, who has been active in helping us to create this, without whose help it would never have been born, this program. So I would like to thank you, and I would like to tell you that it is continuing and it has apparently a wonderful future. Today, we would like you to listen to Dr. Wendy Lower, who is assistant professor at Towson University. We have been really indeed, I come back to this, what you already once heard, we have been indeed that was suggested to us that we have a lecture on the Ukraine, and Mr. Massey has been very emotional about remembering what he has heard about the Ukraine. And as we went home and we found Wendy Lower, I just had this incredible discovery, indeed, what has happened just lately in research regarding this absolutely important, one of the most important topics. So I think I should stop here, and I should ask Dr. Lower to come to us and talk to us about the Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Osvath. Thank you, all of you, Debbie Pfister, for your wonderful organizational skills. And also, I should second your comment about Professor Osvath's cooking. It was lovely last night for you to take care of me when I got off the plane and I was jet lagged. And of course, Dr. Einsbruck and the Ackerman Center and Provost Weidenthal and Sally Belovsky and Mr. and Mrs. Massey. I share your deep interest in Ukraine. Obviously, I understand, having traveled there myself, once going to this particular part of the world, how this can impact you and basically change your course, your direction, as it did mine when I first went there in the summer of 1992. I'd like to start off my lecture tonight with a slide of Vasily Grossman. In the fall of 1943, the Red Army advanced toward Kiev, forcing the Nazi occupiers to flee. Vasily Grossman, a well-known Soviet newspaper correspondent and Jewish literary figure from Ukraine, published this report in the Soviet newspaper entitled Red Star, and I quote, "The Germans have placed a cordon of troops around the huge grave in Babi Yar, where the bodies of 50,000 Jews slaughtered in Kiev at the end of September 1941 are buried. The Germans are feverishly digging up corpses and burning them. Are they so mad as to think that they can hide their evil traces, which have been branded with Ukraine's tears and blood, and will forever burn so brightly even on the darkest of nights? As Grossman continued with the Red Army, advancing westward across Ukraine, eventually reaching Berlin, he would discover more evidence of the Holocaust in the mass graves and testimonies of survivors who emerged from the rubble of destroyed shtetls and hiding places in the forests. He learned in his own hometown of Berdichev how his mother suffered the tragic fate of most Jews. The story of the Holocaust in Ukraine is not that well known, seemingly overshadowed by the shocking discovery of the more modern industrial-style killing at Auschwitz and other spots in Poland, where half of Europe's Jews perished. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, new information has become available to researchers in the archives and in the testimonies of survivors and eyewitnesses. We are finding in particular that the number of Jewish victims in Ukraine, the former center of Jewish life in the Tsarist Empire, is in fact higher than previously estimated. It was previously estimated to be about 900,000. Within the borders of independent Ukraine, as it appears today on the map of Europe, the number now has climbed up to 1.5 million Jews. Less than 2% survived the occupation, and the vast majority died at gunpoint. So what is this place, Babi Yar? A Holocaust survivor from Kiev, David Budnik, explained in his testimony, and I'm going to quote from that, this is a map of the area of where Babi Yar is today. This is a contemporary map. Obviously, you can see from the installations and the roadways and so forth. But this is the extent of it. It's situated about in the northwest corner of the city outskirts. I'm quoting from Mr. Budnik's testimony. Babi Yar. In Russian, Babi Yar means the old woman's or grandmother's ravine. Yar means ravine. The ravine was located in the suburb of Kiev, and this ravine ran over 2.5 kilometers in length and more than 50 meters deep. At the bottom was a little river. Today, the words Babi Yar ring as ominously as Majdanek or Auschwitz or Treblinka. This place, where people used to come to relax and be entertained, became the site of the mass slaughter of thousands of people. Over the course of 2 days, September 29th and 30th, 1941, the Jewish population of the city was executed there. 33,711 people, half of them women. The location and geography of Babi Yar, I'm continuing with Budnik's testimony, were conducive to the Germans' plans. The slopes were steep, in some places even vertical. A direct road ran from the ravine here to the center of the city. The residential area was separated from the ravine by a prison and a cemetery, so there would be no witnesses to the mass murder. Here they shot partisans, members of the underground, communists, members of the Komsomol, Red Army soldiers, railway workers, members of the military. They shot sailors from the Dnieper fleet. They shot Ukrainians, Russians, Jews, Poles. They shot anybody they deemed necessary to kill, systematically and deliberately. Actually, there were over 100,000 Jews in the city of Kiev when the Germans occupied it in September 1941. So it seems that when combined with the numerous other victims who perished there, that this unusually large ravine became the Nazis' largest mass shooting site in Ukraine, perhaps in all of occupied Europe. The history of this killing site began on September 28th, when the German military authorities posted a notice all over the city of Kiev that read, and here is a picture again of another map. This map actually is from the wartime period, showing the road and the location of Babi Yar to the left. You can see those little markings here. This is a German military map. And this is the notice that was posted around the city. And it reads, all Jews living in the city of Kiev and its vicinity are to report by 8 o'clock on the morning of Monday, September 29th, 1941, at the corner of Melnikovsky and Doktorov streets near the cemetery. They are to take with them documents, money, valuables, as well as warm clothes, underwear, etc. Any Jew not carrying this instruction and who is found elsewhere will be shot. Any civilian entering flats evacuated by Jews and stealing property will also be shot. Observers did not realize that this poster was a death sentence for Jews. They really thought that they would be deported to Palestine. The father of the poet Kuznetsov told his son, And Kuznetsov would later write a novel that inspired the memorial at Babi Yar through Yevtushenko, the poet. And this is a quote from the son who heard his father's reaction to the posting of this notice. Quote, "I've got great news for you. From tomorrow, there won't be a single Yid left in Kiev." Yid is a Russian term, a derogatory Russian term referring to Jews, or Jew in particular, in singular in this case. "It seems it's true what they said about them setting fire to the Krishatik. Thank the Lord for that. That'll pay them back for getting rich at our expense, the bastards. Now they can go off to their blessed Palestine, or at any rate, the Germans will deal with them. They're being deported." On Monday, September 29th, thousands of Jews appeared at the designated street corner in Kiev's western district. A middle-aged school teacher, a Russian school teacher named Nartova, wrote about it in her diary and viewed the scene from her balcony. I quote, "People are moving in an endless row, overflowing the entire street and sidewalks. Women and men are walking, young girls, children, old people, and entire families. Many carry their belongings on wheelbarrows, but most of them are carrying things on their backs. They walk in silence, quietly. How awful. It went on like this for a very long time, the entire day, and into the evening, and only then did the crowd become smaller." The diarist wrote that the scene was repeated, quote, "and so it went on for several days." But not all observers were sympathetic. Some attacked the Jews as they walked, grabbing their belongings and then running away. Some men made lewd remarks to passing young Jewish women. When the Jews arrived at the designated site on Melnik Street, the confusion began. Many non-Jews, spouses and friends, were told to go home. Local Ukrainian police continued with the ruse about Palestine, yelling, "Hurry, the trains are waiting." German soldiers and order police battalion members started to close in around the arriving Jews, prodding them toward the Jewish cemetery and farther on where the large ravine was. Semi-automatic gunshots resounded from there. A checkpoint was established of German and Ukrainian guards. One could enter freely, but once one entered, one could not get back out. While the people walked on, they were subjected to a gauntlet of German security police who immediately grabbed visible valuables, especially fur coats. Piles of food and clothing appeared to the left and right of the tree-lined path. German soldiers stood between the trees with guns, clubs, some had dogs. As one approached the ravine, where the gunfire was louder, the beatings continued. Blows from the butts of rifles and clubs. The sudden violent bloodshed, unexpected blows paralyzed most in fear and shock, and when one was too far along the path and surrounded by guards, if one tried to turn back, one was beaten more. The Germans had deployed a large force of police and military power. The special unit Sonderkommando 4A led the action, and they were joined by members of 3 police battalions and a Ukrainian auxiliary police unit known as the Bukovina Battalion. The dogs attacked people while the Ukrainian police, with brass knuckles and clubs, forced people to undress. People went to their death half-clad and covered in blood. They were forced to line up in groups of 10 along the wall of the ravine and shot by German machine gunners who stood opposite. These are photos of Babi Yar from early October 1941. The executioners did not have enough time to finish their job. Therefore, they began to put 2 people together, head by head, so that one bullet would kill 2 people. The wounded people were killed with shovels. The children were thrown into the ravine alive and buried with them. Most Ukrainians were shocked by the brutality. Irina Korshnova wrote in her diary about the rumors swirling around town on September 29th. Quote, "People say that all the Jews are being shot, all of them. They are chased into Babi Yar, and there, I don't know. I only know one thing. There is something terrible, horrible going on, something inconceivable which cannot be understood, grasped, or explained." The Germans put up more posters in town, warning that anyone who helped a Jew would be shot. Local Ukrainians, fearful, horrified, and also harboring their own prejudices, distanced themselves from the Jews, the few Jews who remained. Outside the synagogue in Kiev, after the big massacre of September, 9 elderly Jews sat, day and night, with no food, nothing, hunched over on the street in shock and despair. They collapsed, hungry, and soon fell ill. People just walked by them and looked the other way. After some time, a Ukrainian approached a German patrolman nearby and asked, "Why don't you shoot those old Jews?" The German soldier walked over, thought for a moment, pulled out his gun, and pulled the trigger. How could this happen? Why did it happen? The collapse of the Soviet Union has yielded other changes in Holocaust research and scholarship above and beyond a recalculation of Jewish losses and more detailed descriptions of the mass murder in the killing fields, not the killing centers. Instead of viewing events in the East from the perspective of Berlin as a broad panorama, a vast landscape, new sources are enabling us to look at events from the perspective of Babi Yar and looking westward, reflecting back on Berlin. We are beginning to better understand the multi-causality of the Holocaust, the importance of regional settings, and history's imperial context. Tonight, I would like to focus on two aspects of the history that have come into sharper relief in recent years. First, regional records and other sources from Ukraine reveal how central leaders, their regional functionaries, and the local population interacted in initiating and then carrying through the policy of genocide. Second, the Nazi notion of a European empire is becoming clearer, and specifically, the priority of anti-Jewish policies within Hitler's Lebensraum schemes. In Ukraine, we see the clear intersection of Nazi colonial dreams and genocide. These photos that I've chosen, let me just explain them a little bit, take a moment. You recognize this man. Hitler in Berdichev, Ukraine, in August 6, 1941. And as you can see, of course, he's surrounded by these throngs of soldiers and very enthusiastic. This is kind of high point of the campaign, the invasion of the Soviet Union. And I was struck by these nurses, these German Red Cross nurses, women who were out there at this time in the field. And tomorrow I'll be talking a little bit more about the role of women in the genocide. If you can endure the talk tonight, I encourage you to come back tomorrow. Here is a photo that recently came to light. The photo albums of Heinrich Himmler, which actually belonged to him and his daughter, and were confiscated by the U.S. Army in May 1945, and were kind of in circulation in the world of collectors here in America. The albums were finally brought to the Holocaust Museum and donated. And in these albums, we find a lot of snapshots of these very high-ranking, the highest-ranking officials of the regime, Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, and their presence in the East. And they're sending these photos back to their family members, explaining and writing little notes on the backs of them about where they were and with whom they met. And so now we're able to kind of match up this photographic evidence with diaries and speeches and kind of place the leaders in these locations in the East and understand when they're making decisions, for instance, that they were actually present, that they witnessed some of these events. Here's another photograph from that photo album that just emerged of Himmler in Ukraine. How do we trace the interaction of the center and periphery? What was the imperial structure that furthered the radical violence of the Holocaust? Did the lawlessness and colonial structure of the Wild East, which gave regional leaders more autonomy, mean that they were responsible for initiating the genocide and steered the policy more than their superiors in Berlin? In other words, how removed was Berlin from Babi Yar? I argue that the leadership was not removed from events, that they deliberately went out to the field not only to bask in the glory of their newly won territories, but also to make decisions in the field and push through policies that they deemed most important to the future of the Reich. In fact, in the heyday of Nazi rule in Ukraine, Heinrich Himmler gave a famous speech to his top brass in the SS police, who were gathered at his Hegewald headquarters, his secret compound near Zhytomyr, Ukraine. That's about 100 miles west of Kiev. And during this meeting, he urged his men, I quote, "Make decisions in the field. I do not make decisions in Berlin. Rather, I drive to Lublin, Lemberg, Reval, and at these places in the evening, then 8, 10, 12 major decisions are made on the spot." In fact, it was this same field headquarters in Ukraine where Himmler had decided a few weeks before this speech to, quote, "Clean the territory of Ukraine for the future settlement of Germans. The Ukrainian population should be brought to a minimum." This announcement occurred after he had lunch with with Hitler, who was about 30 miles away at his Vinica headquarters. They deliberately, the two of them placed their headquarters near each other in Ukraine. in the summer of 42. Thus, Nazi leaders relished their mobility because it allowed them to participate in the historic events that they set in motion. The history of the Holocaust offers the most glaring example of the dynamic interaction of the center and the periphery. In addition to on-the-spot decision-making and pep talks in the field, Nazi leaders established the administrative framework for implementing the genocide. They deployed the manpower and material to carry out the Holocaust, and knowing full well the criminality of their actions, established a special commando unit to hide the traces of the mass murder. Hitler's war against the Soviet Union was, in Nazi thinking, the ultimate racial political showdown between Nazism and Judeo-Bolshevism. As Hitler, his military high command, and SS police leaders such as Reinhard Heydrich prepared for the invasion of the Soviet Union, they issued decrees and guidelines for the troops that defined the campaign as a war of annihilation against Judeo-Bolshevism. Besides saboteurs, commissars, and political resistors, the leadership listed the Jews as a racial category to be targeted. Additional directives from the leadership reached the regional commanders in Ukraine as the campaign was underway in July 1941. Heydrich told his leaders that all Jewish men between the ages of 17 and 45 years old were subject to arrest and execution. And he stressed the division of labor between the army and the SS and police, who were engaged in these so-called security measures. Here's an example of the ideological indoctrination or propaganda element of the campaign in the summer of 1941. This is a leaflet that was dropped by the Luftwaffe across Ukraine in huge numbers. I found quite a bit of reports about these leaflets. And what it says, and I've got a translation there, is beat the Jew commissars. This is his top section of the leaflet. His mug asks for a brick. Those who abandon the Red Army and surrender to the Germans will be treated well. So in this case, we have a propaganda leaflet which is trying to persuade Red Army soldiers to abandon the army. So they want to instill defeatism in order to hasten the victory from the Nazi side. And there's this false promise that the Soviet POWs are going to be treated well. And of course, those of you who know the history know that Soviet POWs were killed in the millions. As many as 3 million were killed as a result of Operation Barbarossa. And the death rate was incredibly high. By the end of December 1941, in the POW camps, the death rate was about 6,000 per day. But it's interesting to see how that defeatism was couched in these anti-Semitic terms, that they assumed and believed that by referring to the Soviet system as a Jewish system, that these soldiers would be persuaded to surrender. Less than a month into the campaign, the Nazis expanded the killing. Heinrich Himmler's right-hand man in Ukraine, Friedrich Jeckeln, approved the inclusion of women in massacres as of mid-July 1941. And a few weeks later, the commander of the 17th Army in Vinnytsia told his troops to target Jews in reprisal actions. So now I'm just explaining how the military has blood on its hands in the Holocaust. In this case, the commander of the 17th Army said, don't bother to arrest Jews in advance, he wrote in his report, to have on hand for future reprisal actions. There will be reason to kill them soon enough. They were getting into this pattern. If there was a local incident, for instance, a bomb went off, which was the case in Kiev when the Krещатик exploded, this major boulevard in Kiev, in early September 1941. This was the cause that the Germans presented to local populations, the reason why Jews were going to be deported to Babi, outside the outskirts of the city, as a reprisal measure. In this case, the military commander is saying, don't even pretend that we're going to come up with these ruses or these reprisal measures. The Jews will be killed in any case. In mid-August 1941, Jewish babies and toddlers who had been left orphaned by massacres of their parents were locked in a schoolhouse in Bela Tserkva. It's a very important case from August 41 in Ukraine, in which we can see the escalation from the killing of Jewish men who were deemed the most immediate security threat in those terms. And now what's happened is after the Jewish men are killed, and then the Jewish women are then included in that, then you have, what do you do with the Jewish children now who are orphaned? In this case, in Bela Tserkva, we see some confusion at the lower levels among regional commanders. They're saying, what should we do with these orphans? They're in this schoolhouse. There are about 90 of them are crying. There's no one to take care of them. What should we do? And you can see the flurry in the documentation. They start talking to one another. What should we do? What should we do? And this goes all the way up to the general, the head of the 6th Army, von Reichenau. This is this gentleman right here, who says, and I quote, that they should be killed. And this is the reason why. Once an action against Jews is started, it should be carried out in an expedient manner. He's saying once you kill the parents, you must continue with the action. Disorder and the jeopardizing of troop discipline were among his main concerns in those terms. Yet he was also openly ideological, fuming that the army was not doing enough to annihilate Judeo-Bolshevism. Even before von Reichenau, who was the highest commander in the region at the time, approved the massacre of the children, his subordinates in the Army and the SS Police had already been planning the action. And we have documentation about that. One of the lower level commanders said that this, quote, this brood had to be stamped out. So at the lower level, his lower level commanders anticipated that this should be done. And what caused the hesitation and the confusion at this point was not whether more Jews should be killed, but who was going to do it, how, and when. With the onset of the mass murder of entire Jewish communities in Ukraine and in the Soviet Union in August 1941, the top officials governing the military and civilian zones issued their own orders about how to handle the Jewish population. It's interesting to see in the instance, if you know the history of ghettos, for instance, in Poland, how the history of ghettos is quite different in Ukraine than in Poland. That this chronological kind of escalation of ghettoization leading to deportation to camps, this is not what happens in most of Ukraine. In most of Ukraine, ghettos were, and I quote from one of the reports at this time, unnecessary and not useful. Instead, Jews were brought to kind of holding pens or sites to detain them, in some cases old schools, synagogues, even railway cars. And they were called ghettos. That's what the poster would say in town. It was another ruse, and Jews would respond to that, thinking they were being brought to a ghetto. There was an historical precedent for that, when in fact they were just brought to the site to be kind of contained for a while until the actual mass shooting could be organized and the weapons obtained and the local auxiliaries organized and so forth. Almost all Jews were killed in or near their hometowns. Neighbors witnessed the process, and many contributed to the violence in pogroms. As many as 12,000 died in pogroms in western Ukraine, in and around the city of Lviv. Pogroms were very widespread in western Ukraine, but not so as the Germans advanced farther east. There were fewer pogroms. This is a map, by the way, of a German map from 1942. Just to give you an idea, the history of the Holocaust in Ukraine is rather complicated because there are significant regional differences, so I try not to complicate it. But this is the civilian zone. These are civilian, after the army advanced farther eastward, this territory here is all military occupation zone. These are the civilian administrators that were known as commissars. And this western part of Ukraine, what is of Ukraine today, Lviv or Galicia, was then attached to Poland, Nazi-occupied Poland. This part here, this was just oriented, this is called Transnistria. It's what is mostly Moldova today, and that was administered by the Romanians. So in this entire territory here of what would be close to contemporary Ukraine, the death toll reached about 1.5 million. And in this swath of territory here, which is historically the Pale of Settlement, about 650,000 Jews were killed, and then the other piece here, about 500,000. About half of the Jews who were killed in what is today Galicia, so about 300,000, were sent to Belzec, the extermination center of Belzec in 1902, 1943. There were some gas vans operating in Ukraine as well, in Kiev, Poltava, and Dnipropetrovsk. The expansion of the mass murder brought with it local conflicts about who was authorized to kill Jews, when the action should occur, and how the killing should be carried out. But these tensions were soon resolved by a combined effort of Nazi leaders who clarified the division of labor and local commanders in the military and SS police who might have had mixed views about the policy, but at least shared a commitment to preserve order and not challenge the authority of superiors. With each killing action, regional officials in the Army and SS and police advanced their methods, even determining precisely the distance between the executioner and the victim, the position of the victim, facing away from the shooter or facing towards, that women should carry their infants instead of separating women and children, and that forcing the Jews to remove their clothes beforehand would make the seizure and processing of their valuables more efficient. And lastly, they quickly realized that Ukrainians and local ethnic Germans could be relied upon to assist with the killing, and that few within the German administration would openly resist the mass murder. Here we have some images from this particular image is part of a series of 3 images. This is Kamenets-Podolsk, August 1941. Interesting story that the photos were taken by a Jewish Hungarian truck driver who was in the region as a laborer, had a camera. And the other 2 photos, if you see them, you can actually see the steering wheel from his truck through with the Jews marching the distance. You'll note here that in this case, this elderly man is actually being carried. This incident from August 1941, preceding Babi Yar, was the largest mass shooting up until that point. 23,600 Jews were killed in 2 days, August 26th, August 27th. And a good number of them were actually from Hungary, from this area that Hungary had annexed called Karpati. And the Hungarians pushed these refugees out. There was a discussion between the Germans and the Hungarians going up to the Foreign Office at the diplomatic level about what to do with these Jewish refugees. And it became, quote unquote, a refugee problem. And in these discussions, in the documentation, finally the military and the foreign officials, the diplomats said, we'll let Yekeln take care of this, just in those terms. And Yekeln from the SS and police, he was the top SS and policeman in Ukraine, he went down and carried out this mass shooting. And that, in a way, he honed his skills there and then brought them to Babi Yar. He developed this so-called method, they're called the sardine method, and brought that to Babi Yar. That's part of this escalating history. This is from 1942. A series of photos from Volhynia. Many of the Jews that were left in Ukraine after the first wave of killings in 41 were in the western part of Ukraine, in the region of Volhynia, and were killed in ghetto liquidations in the summer and the fall of 42. As I mentioned before, Himmler had been at his headquarters in August 42 and said, no more Jews should be in Ukraine by the end of the year. And so there was this massive liquidation wave in the fall of 1942. Now, some of those Jews who did survive, as I said, the survival rate was very low, less than 2%, survived because they were brought into a large construction project, one of the largest construction projects in Ukraine at this time, which was the construction of the Autobahn. The Germans had these very elaborate plans for Ukraine to be a kind of, as I said, Lebensraum. They had these utopian goals for transforming Ukraine into a agrarian playground. And in order to get there quickly from Berlin, from the Reich, they envisioned these very nice highway system, the Autobahn. And tens of thousands of Jews were employed on that, along with POWs. About 25,000 Jews died, however, in the construction of the Autobahn. The Holocaust was implemented region by region down to the smallest localities, but the decentralization of the final solution policy did not result in administrative chaos. On the contrary, ad hoc collaboration at the district level demonstrated the totality of what historian, political scientist Raoul Hilberg termed the machinery of destruction. The Gestapo security police outposts in Ukraine were few and far between. In the smallest of the gendarme police stations in rural towns such as Ruzhin, there were 2 to 3 German officers, supported by 25 Ukrainian and ethnic German policemen, responsible for covering 1,800 square kilometers and policing 189,000 inhabitants. Just to give you an idea of this large amounts of territory, vast territory that the Germans were trying to administer with a very thin layer of officials, and that was deliberate. They really relied on the local population to implement their policies. But staff shortages did not slow the killing process or obstruct the Germans' ability to hunt down every last Jew. Many officials in non-police functions stepped forward to help or were pressured to do so. Like the Berlin Center bureaucrats in Hilberg's analysis, the German functionaries in Ukraine, quote, displayed a striking pathfinding ability in the absence of directives, a fundamental comprehension of the task, even when there were not explicit communications. Thus, the Nazi implementation of the final solution was an ongoing invention of central and peripheral leaders. Berlin established the aims and administrative framework, but the process of mass murder developed from the ground up, often after on-the-spot decision-making that included a mix of German officials and professionals who tried to perfect the killing methods. Most of the regional German functionaries who carried out the killing and managed the so-called Jewish question in their respective districts were university-degreed, middle-ranking bureaucrats and Nazi ideologues who suddenly found themselves in positions of extreme power. The shooting commandos were staffed with men in their 30s, mostly married with children, many with law degrees. When a regional administrator such as Commissar Kurt Klemm in Zhytomyr declared his district judenfrei, or free of Jews, in the summer of 1942, he also sought approbation from his superiors for a job well done. Those who felt uneasy about the massacres found ways to adapt to the genocide. One could silently acquiesce, look the other way, nod in approval, or find others to do the most gruesome tasks, such as killing children, which for most have become a statistical detail not to be recorded in the war diaries and other official documents. Now to briefly address my second point. What does colonialism have to do with the Holocaust? The Nazi implementation of the genocide occurred mainly in territories slated for Germanization, as Himmler called it. There is a relationship between the ideas and dynamic of Nazi empire building and the Holocaust. But what is this relationship exactly? You have all probably heard of the term Lebensraum, living space. The German demand for more territory was not Hitler's idea. It was a movement from the 19th century that developed alongside the growth of German nationalism and the Kaiserreich in Europe and overseas. During the Nazi era, the concept took on a new meaning. The desired territory in Eastern Europe would become living space for Aryans or Germans only, and Jews specifically had no future in this space. Thus, inherently wrapped up in Nazi expansionism were exclusionary, potentially genocidal population policies that assumed certain inferior races or biological threats would be removed or disappear. At the heart of Nazi imperialism was a revolution in the ethnic or racial makeup of Eastern Europe. Here you can see this is a southern Ukraine around the Black Sea, the so-called Black Sea Germans. These are Germans who had migrated during the reign of Catherine the Great in the 18th century and colonized this region. They were invited, actually, to come in as tradesperson and agriculturalists and to develop the region, and they were still there. Many of them had been deported in the 30s under Stalin's policies, but there were still quite a few. There were about 200,000 in Ukraine, and the Germans were really anxious to kind of tap that local resource of racial brothers, as it were, to help build, to build up this empire. So here is this colony, historic colony, Halbstadt. And this section here you have this is called the German shop, Deutsche Laden. These are clearly kind of propaganda photos, but this is part of the thinking of the time, the Nazi plans and the fantasies of the time that it's important to take seriously, because this is why a lot of this happened. And here's one of Himmler's SS outposts in this colony in southern Ukraine. Scholars of Nazi imperialism and scholars of the Holocaust have not connected the two themes and analyzed them in depth. In the 1950s, Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish lawyer and political scientist who coined the term genocide, began to study the historical relationship between imperialism and genocide, but his manuscript on this topic was not published. Hannah Arendt, drawing from Lemkin's work, dealt with the theme briefly in her work, Origins of Totalitarianism. More recently, a German historian has linked the Nazi implementation of the final solution to the resettlement of ethnic Germans, or as they're called, Volksdeutsche, in Poland. What is coming to light is that the Nazi war against the Jews was an integral part, indeed a central dynamic, in the German attempt at empire building in Europe. Nazi rule in the East cannot be understood strictly as the mechanisms of an occupation administration, but must be placed within a broader ideological context of the imperial dreams that motivated the conquest from the start. In Hitler's monologues and the writings of Heinrich Himmler and Alfred Rosenberg, who was the Reich minister for the occupied Eastern territories, he was in charge of all the civilian administrators, one finds references to the North American frontier, the British Empire in India, and the European exploitation of Africa. Already in Hitler's book Mein Kampf, he set the tone, and I quote, "We National Socialists consciously draw a line beneath the foreign policy of our pre-war period. We take up where we broke off 600 years ago. We stop the endless German movement to the south and west and turn our gaze to the east. At long last, we break off the colonial and commercial policy of the pre-war period and shift to the soil policy of the future." End quote. In the euphoria of victory of July 1941, as historian Christopher Browning put it, Hitler waxed about his colonial schemes for Ukraine. He called the territory a future Garden of Eden, while stressing that the natives, the Ukrainian Negroes as he called them, and other inferior races, especially the Jews, will be removed. Quoting Hitler from the summer of 41 now, "The Jew, that destroyer, we shall drive out. Our colonizing penetration must be constantly progressive until it reaches the stage where our colonies far outnumber the local inhabitants. Our colonists far outnumber the local inhabitants." Likewise, Himmler described Eastern Europe as Germany's Californian paradise and spoke of Germany's manifest destiny. Rosenberg sent his regional commissaries in Ukraine a reading list that included titles such as, these are books that they were reading, With My Backpack to India, In the African Jungle, alongside another book entitled The Jewish World Plague. A popular family board game at the time promoted armed German farmers and pioneers competing for the fertile black earth of Ukraine. In my book, Nazi Empire Building and the Holocaust in Ukraine, I argue that Nazi leaders derived many of their colonialist ambitions from European models, but the Nazi takeover of Ukraine was unprecedented in its application of violence, racism, anti-Semitism, and militarism. Nazi leaders embarked on a new imperialist vision for Europe. Hence, Himmler would argue that the Nazi approach to colonizing Europe centered on Germanization or Aryanization. This was, as Himmler stated, not in the old sense of bringing the German language and German laws to the people dwelling in that area, but to ensure that in the East only people of genuinely German Teutonic blood shall live. If leaders in Berlin were determined to realize such imperialist, racist, and anti-Semitic ambitions in Eastern Europe, did their functionaries share a similar worldview? Did they embrace these ideas and experiments in empire building? I would argue not entirely. It is true that the cast of Nazi adventurers who ravaged Ukraine from 1941 to 1944, most of them had proven themselves as SA-old fighters, kind of street fighters from the 1920s and 30s, and they perceived their role in Ukraine as being legitimately linked to Europe's history of conquest and rule. They prided themselves on being revolutionaries with a new utopian vision of an Aryan-dominated Europe. Ultimately, however, the exigencies of the war effort and mounting partisan warfare in the civilian zones where they govern prevented German leaders from realizing their colonial dreams. They tested out some schemes that proved disastrous. One such scheme or colonial experiment was tested out in the secure zone between Hitler's and Himmler's headquarters. I mentioned that they deliberately set up their headquarters. They're only about 30 miles between them. Himmler was here in Zhytomyr, and actually Hitler was down here in Vinica, just a little bit farther south. So this is this territory between the two headquarters, and they repaired the road, and they turned this into a special kind of German expressway, and this was heavily secured area, as you can imagine. In the autumn of 1942, after the territory had been cleared of Jews, over 10,000 ethnic Germans were concentrated in this area called Hegewald, or Preservation Forest. The area was administered by the SS and police Ukrainians who had resided there were deported to labor camps or to the Reich and forced to work for their new masters on the farms. In addition to dozens of kindergartens and vocational training programs and political indoctrination programs, SS police led marching exercises. Himmler and his top advisors introduced new models in farming, drawing from Germany's imperial past in Africa. The Togo Ost Society was established in Zhytomyr at the end of 1942. And yet the formation of Hagewald and other experimental colonies in Ukraine and Poland did not go as smoothly as Nazi leaders had expected. The Nazis were unable to construct colonies based on the pseudo-scientific notion of race. Many of the contradictions that lay beneath Hitler's and Himmler's fantasies of an Aryan living space reviewed themselves at the local level of practice. Ethnic Germans who had grown up under the Stalinist system were impoverished. Few spoke German, and they lacked the skills that Germans needed to construct their new empire. The Germans had killed most of the skilled laborers in the region, the Jews. Ukrainians, realizing their own future was not bright under the Germans, worked begrudgingly for the Germans and increasingly engaged in sabotage and resistance activities. Within the German administration itself, the same regional commissars and SS policemen, who rarely questioned the eradication of those deemed inferior, remained uncertain, skeptical, and less enthusiastic about their role in the so-called Aryan utopia. The realities of the war of destruction were far from Hitler's fantasy of a Garden of Eden. When Himmler's deputies tried to give SS police agents a colonization kind of pep talk about how to make the most of the dire situation, such as the attacks by Soviet partisans, the fact that Volksdeutsche couldn't speak German and so forth, they often said, "What would the Fuhrer do?" Even Hitler realized that ordinary Germans did not share his appreciation for colonies and his vision of a Germanized Russia. The task of his generation, as Hitler explained it, was to instill in younger Germans a feeling of pride as settlers and pioneers in the East. There they will be expected, he said, to build up something truly magnificent. Quote, "The German colonists ought to live on spacious farms, the governors in palaces. What India was for England, the territories of Russia will be for us. If only I could make the German people understand that this space means our future. Europe is not a geographic entity," he said, "it is a racial entity." Mounting military defeats and the unraveling of Nazi rule on the new frontier illuminated the fact that the Nazi attempt at empire building was morally and intellectually bankrupt, and in the context of a protracted war of destruction, not feasible. German leaders were able to carry out the first step in their larger plan of Germanizing Europe, the destruction of the Jews. For this, they benefited from the widespread support of their subordinates in the field and the participation or indifference of the indigenous peoples in their empire. Hitler's war against the Jews in Ukraine was indeed a multi-pronged campaign. Its force drew from centuries of European anti-Semitism, but other historical trajectories are evident. Hitler combined war and empire building with a people's revolution, a restructuring and a reordering society based upon a radically utopian ideology. Hitler and Himmler sought their place in history, comparing themselves to the great imperialists and noting the unchecked atrocities committed by Genghis Khan, Cortez, and Napoleon. They placed themselves within the pantheon of global supermen, really a rogues gallery of warriors. Unique to the dynamic of the Nazis' racial imperial war in Europe was the so-called Jewish threat and the scope and methods of Nazi leaders applied to vanquish this so-called enemy. That is, innocent men, women, and children who were tragically the most vulnerable minority in Europe. Berlin and Babi Yar may have been 750 miles apart, but in many respects they were very close. The core beliefs, practices, and aims of Hitler's Germany were ultimately realized in the eastern stretches of its empire, not in its capital city of Berlin. Nazi leaders were not removed from events sitting behind their desks in Berlin. They were actively promoting the most radical policies in the field. Regional functionaries in Ukraine often acted independently, devising new methods of persecution, putting their own personal stamp on the terror, or even slowing the killing process by secretly retaining Jewish laborers. Still, Nazi leaders, whether physically present or indirectly involved, shaped events at the local level to a far greater extent than one might otherwise assume, given the vastness of the occupied territory. They empowered local leaders to hunt down and kill Jews without bureaucratic and legal restraints. They communicated this aim clearly in writing and verbally. They placed their most loyal henchmen in key positions of power to rest. Above and beyond their direct orders and physical presence, the core of the leadership shaped the Holocaust in Ukraine in less tangible ways. At a psychological level, regional SS police, civilian governors were motivated to diligently carry out their duties without questioning authority and to work towards their superiors in what Germans refer to as anticipatory obedience. Once the murder of Jews was sanctioned by the state, regional officials carried it out without explicit instructions. The resulting climate was one of silent mutual agreement that bridged the spatial divide between the center and the periphery. Without Berlin, there would have not been Babi Yar, and in many ways, Babi Yar also defined Berlin by demonstrating to the leadership that genocide was possible. Babi Yar emboldened Nazi leaders to expand their war against the Jews in Ukraine to all of Europe and beyond. The dynamism of the two, the central driving forces of the leadership, and the expressed willingness of subordinates to carry out the murder, as well as the local resourcefulness of the lower-level functionaries and collaborators. The Holocaust did not require the conditions of modernity as such. The mass shooting pits were a form of systematic murder. There was a division of labor shared by a crosscut of society in groups, Germans, Ukrainians, ethnic Germans, Russians, among others. All of this was necessary for the Holocaust to happen. The Shoah was in its relentless scope and methods the most extreme genocidal policy of the Reich and arguably the defining feature of Nazi conquest and rule. When we think of the legacy of the Third Reich, that is when we ask whether Hitler, like other historic conquerors, left anything of any value in the places his regime controlled. To that question, I reply that the legacy of Hitler's empire in Europe is Babi Yar, as well as Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Mali Trostenets near Minsk, the Ninth Fort near Kovno, Rumbuli Forest near Riga, and tens of thousands of mass murder sites and labor camps that covered the map of Europe during the Second World War. These sites were and continue to be the topography of terror that we associate with Nazism, and Ukraine's place in this landscape is critical to our understanding of the Holocaust and memorialization of its victims. Gazing in horror at this landscape in the spring of 1943, a Jewish slave laborer in Ukraine named Samuel Goldfarb wrote in his diary, this is from April 11, 1943. He didn't survive. He actually died 2 months later. Today, the tragedy of Jews does not particularly occupy the thoughts of the politicians. The population by its silence allows for it. Rarely, very rarely, does one see an active expression of sympathy on the part of the population. The majority of the populace continues to persist in their aversion to Jews despite scenes of martyrdom, the likes of which the world has never yet witnessed. The tombs and graves of people murdered in martyrdom are ever increasing across the length and breadth of the country. Every village and town, every forest brims with graves, looming from a distance, as an historical lesson and a warning. Once the living witnesses are gone, then those graves will speak volumes. They will accuse the whole world with an eloquence 100-fold mightier of having committed or having failed to act against the cruelest of crimes. Besides the inaction of bystanders, which so enraged our diarist Goldfarb in 1943, what lessons can we draw from this history today? I'd like to think that humans are not by nature a violent species, programmed to be warriors and mass murderers. Our future could be different, and we could learn from the horrors of the Second World War. As was clear in Nazi-occupied Ukraine and elsewhere, and oftentimes in our history, humans will carry out the most heinous violent acts when they become obsessed, convinced of an idea. And we see in the Nazi campaign in Ukraine the tragic power of an idea steeped in imperial nationalist arrogance and driven by a racialist, and specifically in this case, anti-Semitic hatred. Thank you.
From Dr. Laura. She will be happy to answer. Yes.
I think I'm going to try to stay away from that question, actually. Not that I work in isolation, that I don't, and I'm such a recluse in the archives that I don't look around me and see what's happening, for instance, in Darfur, which is I think, an interesting case of genocide and inaction. And I do get involved in that particular case. But I think that the situation in Israel and Gaza is quite complicated. I really am not in a position to comment. And if I knew more, I would, but I don't.
Yes.
You mentioned in your book Lithuanian police involved in the murder of Ukrainian Jews. Can you elaborate on the use of Lithuanian police in Ukraine? And also, was there an organized general plan to have, say, Ukrainian anti-Semites kill Jews in Poland, say, as happened in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and to take Polish anti-Semites and Baltic anti-Semites and send them to other countries to kill Jews?
There were about 100,000 Ukrainians who were recruited into the auxiliary police forces. And you're absolutely right. And this was something that was common if you look at the history of empire, a kind of divide and rule, pitting different groups, antagonistic groups against one another. And the Germans were really quite skilled at this in bringing Ukrainians, for instance, into Poland, where there was a long history of Polish-Ukrainian animosity and kind of creating this power structure. So that was very clear from Krakow. Mobile battalions of Lithuanians were brought into Ukraine, as well as some Latvian mobile battalions and Ukrainians. They manned the stationary police forces across Ukraine, the gendarme units, so-called Schutzmannschaften, and that was deliberate. In July 1941, Himmler established that whole organization of the Ukrainian auxiliary police. They knew that they needed that manpower. And even though there were conflicts at the highest levels about how to deal with Ukraine as a kind of territorial entity, whether or not Ukrainian nationalists should have any more autonomy, for example, which they were pushing for, there was agreement on the use of Ukrainians as kind of local auxiliaries. They were put in a number of positions, as I said, local stationary police, but also involved, they refer to as askaris, that's again another kind of imperial term from Africa, in the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto in April 43. They were also brought to the Travniki camp outside of Lublin, where they were trained to serve as guards in the killing centers, the extermination centers from Operation Reinhard. So yes, we see Ukrainian collaboration as a very important topic. Bear in mind that Ukraine was the largest population under German occupation, about 32 million. So when you look at the numbers, you have to put them in proportion to the reality of how many Ukrainians were actually kind of at the disposal, if you will, of German occupiers. That's just the question of direct collaboration in the Holocaust in the form of police units. It took on many forms, collaboration. Germans were an integral part of the local administration. They were established several hundred newspapers within Ukraine in which writers and artists were brought in to, for instance, draw really horrible caricatures, anti-Semitic images to kind of keep this anti-Semitic campaign going from a visual standpoint and to enforce among the local population a kind of vigilance in hunting down Jews. So that's kind of intellectuals who were writers and artists who were brought into that campaign. There's some very interesting work going on now. You may have read about it or seen it on TV. A Catholic priest from France, Father Desbois. I highly recommend his book, Holocaust by Bullets, just won the National Jewish Book Award. What he's doing is he's going around to these different sites in Ukraine. He's identified about over 600 mass grave sites and talking to witnesses, people who are still living there, who were around during the war. Mainly, these people were maybe between the ages of 10 and 15 now at the time of the war. They were youngsters, youth. But they were brought into the local killing operations. They were... it's not really fair, I think, to use the word collaboration. They were basically assigned positions of all different types. And the stories that we're getting from these local Ukrainians are helping us fill in the picture from the Ukrainian side, things that weren't in the German documents about what local Ukrainians had to do to carry out the mass murder. Cooks, people were brought in to prepare meals at the killing sites because they often took hours, full day of shootings, and the workers there, the executioners, needed to be fed. Ukrainian women who were brought in to mend the clothes when the Jews were forced to strip naked and they left their clothes there. Those articles of clothing were recycled for those ethnic Germans, for the Volksdeutsche, and so the Ukrainians were brought in to mend the clothes. Young Ukrainian girls were brought in as so-called packers. They had to actually help with in the grave itself, walking on the bodies in what was called a function of packing. Hemp collectors, young people who had to collect hemp that were then, the hemp was thrown in the graves, and then because the corpses were burned with the hemp. The question of collaboration, I think, is undergoing at this moment a reevaluation of what are we talking about specifically, what are people doing, and how were they kind of put in those roles. And thanks to Father Dubois' work, what are they thinking today about that history? Because it's still very much a part of their memory and some of the trauma that they have from the Second World War.
Yes.
You mentioned the complicity of the German regular army in the massacre. How many field-ranking and general officers who were involved survived the war and became part of the NATO command structure in the late 40s and early 50s?
I don't have a number for that, but I have some individual cases. You're right. In fact, one of these individuals is still alive.
Was their past known to the Allied High Command when they were promoted?
Not in this case. This person took on a different name, but there are continuities there. These are hard cases to get at. I mean, I'm thinking of right now, Richard Brightman's co-edited a book on these CIA files that have just been declassified, and that's really the best place to start if you're interested in that, and see, how much these people, like the Galen operation, how people were recruited after the war to fight the Soviets, and their Nazi pasts, whatever crimes they committed were kind of dismissed so that they could kind of carry on the Cold War. But yes, this is a chapter that needs to be researched and written.
Yes.
Were there Spanish Rangers and Romanians, is the Italians, and also a chance to see some of that?
Yeah, in the occupation of Ukraine, there was a sizable number of Hungarians, which is interesting, and there are some cases where Hungarians actually intervened at some pogroms in Galicia on the one hand, and then there are cases in Chernigov where they actually carried out the mass shooting, so it's kind of scattered. And Italian troops as well in the southern sector, but I can't think of any individual stories or documentation that would in any way lead me to comment on whether or not Italian occupation troops were kind of worse or more complicit, or how they responded. That's unfortunately at this point we haven't. Slovak forces, security forces, also involved in the occupation of Ukraine. We've just recently, in the last, I would say, 10 years, explored the role of Wehrmacht complicity among the Germans. And you may know about this exhibit that was traveling around Germany that was very controversial and sparked a huge protest, especially resistance among the veterans. But we haven't gotten to the point where the individual occupation troops from among the Axis members has really been studied in any depth. The Romanian operations were separate. The occupation of the Romanian troops was more independent. But it's interesting because you do see this mix of within the army of the Slovakian, Italian, and Hungarian troops. But it's difficult to at this point to gauge what conclusions we can draw from that. And also in the Waffen-SS. I think about the Waffen-SS, there were independent Waffen-SS units, Dutch, Norwegian, Ukrainian, and again, we've dealt with the Waffen-SS kind of as a broad category, but we haven't broken it down into these units. So students out there, please, I encourage you to start dealing with some of these questions.
Yes, I actually had a question. It's actually come up in our class, and so we're kind of curious. When the Germans set out and occupied Ukraine, we knew that their original idea was elimination of the Jews. But we were also curious, since the Ukraine was slated to be kind of this Garden of Eden and rebirth of the German colony, were the Ukrainians also slated for eventual annihilation? Or were the Germans starting to do this and then just the Soviet counteroffensive pushed them out? That's kind of what we were curious about.
Yeah. There were plans on the eve of Operation Barbarossa. We have evidence of this. Himmler made this big speech at this castle called Wewelsburg. This was part of testimony at Nuremberg after the war, and he said that in this great campaign, in the course of the next 20 to 30 years, the Slavs too will be destroyed, and threw out a number of like 20 to 30 million. And part of that was begun by what they wanted to do was starve out the cities. So through agricultural kind of food policies, they had already began with the invasion by not feeding the urban populations. Like the population of Kiev, I think was half of what it was among Ukrainians by the end of the war, just through the starvation, the lack of food. So this was part of the planning, but it was not considered a kind of immediate priority. It was part of the campaign. But as the war dragged on, they needed the support of the local population vis-a-vis the Red Army and the partisans and so forth. But that was clearly the General Plan Ost, if you study that, very important evidence of these longer-term goals.
Has there been any improvement in the Ukrainian anti-Semitic attitude of late? Have they faced their prior anti-Semitism and questioned it like years ago?
The question as to whether Ukrainians have worked through their past in a manner that we see in Germany, no, they have a long way to go. A very long way to go. The past that they're working through is very selective. When we say Ukrainian Holocaust, they're thinking of the Holodomor, which is the famine that Stalin introduced in 32, 33. They are very focused on their own victimization, their own tragic story, their own tragic narrative, and it's true what they're saying. It's a horrible history, but they don't accept the Holocaust as part of their history. I was telling students earlier today, if you look through their textbooks, and we're doing studies of Ukrainian textbooks, they have 2 textbooks that the Education Ministry is producing right now, and the educational system is a holdover, it's kind of a carryover from the Soviet system, which is to say that teachers there are really controlled by whatever comes out of the ministry. They don't get to shop around and have their choice of textbooks. They really depend on those textbooks from the ministry. And what's coming out of there now is when the Holocaust is addressed, which it is in a marginal way, it's about Anne Frank and about Auschwitz. It's not about Kamenets-Podolsk or the fact that in the very towns where these teachers are conducting their classes, that there are mass graves right outside the town. So it's a major problem, and the International Task Force for Holocaust Education has been very supportive and extended the hand and tried to reach out. Various foundations have tried to reach out. The Yad Vashem has been actively trying to train teachers there and bring them to Israel, for example. There's a lot of resistance in Kiev in the government. It's extremely politically controversial, and they, at this point, just kind of, step back away from it, very resistant to it. And there is anti-Semitism. The Babi Yar Memorial, the first one was from 1976. It didn't include mention of the Jews as victims in Babi Yar. September 1991, about a month after Ukraine established its independence, a new memorial was erected at Babi Yar to the Jewish victims in the shape of a menorah. And that has its own history now for the last 15 years of being subject to vandalism. It takes time. People are actively working on it. There's a film now that's in circulation about Babi Yar that the Victor Pinchuk Foundation and the Spielberg Foundation put together. Some books, I have to say, my book is being translated into Ukrainian. I just found out about a month ago. It's being funded by the Dutch government is funding that translation, that with a couple of other books. So, I mean, it takes time. It takes time, but we have to keep our eye out. I mean, it's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen automatically.
Did you see much evidence that the Germans were initially seen as liberators from Stalin?
Yeah, there was plenty of evidence for that. And the Germans, certainly encouraged that, and they were very happy to take newsreels of that and to show the world that they were liberators. They wanted that image to be projected. But yes, in Western Ukraine in particular, they were greeted with salt and bread, and most people, Ukrainians in particular, who had suffered under Stalinism and the extreme Sovietization campaign from 39 to 41, in particular in Western Ukraine, and mass atrocities. When the Soviets retreated, they went into the prisons of Ukraine and just basically, threw a bunch of dynamite, killed tens of thousands of inhabitants of the prisons. They assumed that they would be collaborators with the Germans, and it was pure bloodshed on the eve of the German occupation. So you can imagine under those circumstances that people were hopeful and couldn't imagine that things couldn't get worse. Jews, of course, were not among those who were welcoming the Germans as liberators. Most of the Jews in Western Ukraine had fled Poland, were refugees from Poland, and could anticipate that things were not going to be good. Not the extent of the mass murder, but were not as enthusiastic, obviously.
I think that we have perhaps one more question, and then unfortunately,
In 1939, I was incarcerated in California. I worked for Guide the Social about 1940, after the Germans overrun Russia, the first two people that brought back collaborated, the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians, they wrote that Afghanistan until 1943. In 1943, they took us out of their branches. They were the most vicious people I've ever seen in my life, worse than the SS. In this people, until 1945, I was in Dachau. And in Dachau, after the Americans were already down there, they were still running at the crematorium. Till the last minute, they were the ones down there. So we didn't know their friends. And I wonder, was at many tribunals in Germany. Lots of it. And it came down at the tribunal, the same as the German says. The first people that said, I'm sure that intended to do that. They were forced to. I saw lots of men. But after the war was over in 1945, after I was liberated, I worked for the Secret Service for 4 years down there in Germany. I could have been George. I could have been the jury. I could have been the executioner. But do you think I was an executioner? No. I brought them to the trial. You should see 40 times. They even some generals done by versions. We were all over the last minute. The last word was said that they had anything to do. And we had home surgeons. The home surgeons. You see, they operated. That's full of generosity. These people came up with the same thing as the by versions. There were lies said. Their statement here, I'm sorry, because I was at that time. I was 21 years old and I was 69 pounds. And I was far away from my toilet for a year. So the stage got me. And I'm very scared. The lights don't look like you can never. I've never seen more British people than there. Even when I was brought up poor in my life was of that standard. You know, when you grow up poor as a kid, you don't have to look for the sunlight you were born into it. You get used to it. But these people are vicious. Terrible. You know, you're talking about SS Doma time, you're talking about SD, Sicherheit against Gestapo. I appreciate you saying